This is TWiT.
Let's talk about the FCC side of things here. Now many audiences members actually live in areas where they may only have one internet provider. And the price is high, the service is poor, and they have really no leverage to make it any better. Well, the FCC voted last year to eliminate price caps imposed on some business broadband providers such as AT&T and Verizon. And now what that means for businesses is that FCC eliminated caps in any given county if 50% of potential customers are, quote, are within a half mile of a location served by competitive providers. That means that business customers with just one choice are often considered to be located in a competitive market and no longer benefit from price controls. Now, this decision affects BDSs or business data services, which is actually dedicated to what they call point-to-point broadband links, which are delivered over copper-based TDM networks by phone companies like AT&T, Verizon, and CenturyLink. Now, FCC's decision was challenged in court by the competitive local exchange carriers and purchasers of business broadband, which actually include Sprint and Windstream. But the U.S. Court of Appeals actually agrees with the FCC. The interesting thing here is that the court also rejected challenges to the economic theory and merits of the FCC's competitive market test. Now, here's the court quote of their decision. Quote, the FCC made rational choice which evidence to believe among conflicting evidence in its proceedings, especially predicting that what will happen in the markets under the jurisdiction. Now, they actually get to choose, the FCC actually gets to choose which evidence they believe. Now, some groups like the CFA believe that because nearly every enterprise, nonprofit, and government institution purchases BDS for essential connectivity, charges are ultimately passed on and borne by consumers and taxpayers. Now, in fact, mobile users will also be affected by this because those higher monthly rates, because most wireless carriers actually purchase their network connectivity from BDS providers. So, guys, I want to throw this over to you. I mean, does this make any sense to you? Maybe to you, Curtis, first. Does this rationalization of competitive markets and competition make any sense when it applies to a monopoly in an area?
Well, I don't think so. But then again, I think what we have here is one of those great examples of the fact that language used in laws and regulation may mean something entirely different than it means in normal conversation. I mean, many attorneys depend on this. And so what we have is, something of an Alice in Wonderland thing where the words mean what the regulators say they mean. So what we think about when we talk about the word competitive obviously has been defined to mean something else in terms of regulation. Now, I think that by any rational meaning, if you've only got one incumbent, then it's not competitive. But I also think that what we have is an FCC that has shown itself to be hyper pro-incumbent, right, hyper pro-carrier, and very much non-consumer based. And we're learning that means non-consumer bias, whether the consumer is an individual or a corporation. So I suppose that the lesson to be learned here is that if you want preferential treatment from the FCC, you just need to go out and buy your own network.
Right. Well, the FCC actually put out a brief, and it talks about 3 and even 4 level firms and areas for the markets, but it never really talks about the competition between 1 or even just 2 firms and markets. So why they say a monopoly market is still considered competitive, I don't know. What do you think, Brian? What's the FCC thinking here?
I'm not really sure. I think it may be the fact that it's still, provided you're willing to jump through the hoops of fire and do all the work, that it's still possible to get a waiver and get another provider pulled all the way to your location, provided that other provider is sufficiently motivated, right? So what they might be saying about these particular scenarios is that the CLECs, the carrier local exchanges, those smaller businesses might actually have the facility to cross these paper boundaries, but in reality, it costs those businesses too much to pull service to a location that might only be serviced by one ISP at this point in time. So I'm trying to come up with a rationale, and it just seems utterly corrupt at its core. But I think that might be what they're pointing to. But it really, you called it right out in the core of the court decision, is that they're really leaving it up to the FCC to rationalize what's the reality and what might happen in that market in the future, right? So the court's almost saying, hey, the FCC can predict the future within reasonable parameters about what might happen in a market to create competition. Not really, I'm really trying to play the devil's advocate here, so we're not all just slamming this decision. But it really does seem like the erosion of net neutrality and the erosion of consumer rights when it comes to carrier access was already slipping and really had very few protections in my mind. Is really it's getting worse, not better.
Right. Now, in the FCC's brief, they also claimed a little bit of a rationalization themselves, and they said that the cost of regulation is likely to outweigh the extra cost paid by consumers when dominant carriers can, what they call, exercise market power in the absence of regulation. So that they're basically saying that, hey, if we have a competitive market with one or two, it's going to cost us more to regulate anything than it is to just kind of let it go in the wind. I mean, let's go back to you, Curtis. Is this a way to govern us, to regulate this, to make sure that there's competitive markets, or that the consumers win here, or is there a better way?
Well, you start to get into a whole discussion on the philosophy of regulation, and what we have again is obviously an FCC that operates from the philosophical position that regulations should be as limited as possible. And so they see this as a way of limiting those regulations. Do I think that being a little more proactive might give better results? Well, I do, but that involves my philosophy of regulation. I'm okay with a little bit heavier hand than the current FCC is happy with. I think it gets down to something that's similar, and I'll give an example. Here in Florida, we recently had our primary elections, and the way it's written, if you have no, if all you have, for example, is a Democratic primary in a particular race, if there is no Republican, then the Democratic primary is open. That means everybody can vote because that primary will determine the winner of the election. So there are an awful lot of people who go around doing things like entering write-in candidates for particular races to make sure that there's someone in the other and the primaries aren't open. I think what we have here is the FCC doing things like saying, as long as, say, Hughes satellite exists, then there is no place where you aren't going to have some level of competition. Wherever it's possible to find some dark cable, it's going to be possible to have an option for a different network service. So if you define it in the broadest possible way, then you get to the situation we have here. For most organizations, though, except for the very largest customers, what you really need is a good, strong ISP. And that's where the regulation breaks down under the current situation. I just, like I said, philosophically, I'm comfortable with a bit more regulation than the current FCC Board of Governors is.
Right. So, Brian, you have a little bit of a different view of rationalization of this, right? Because you feel that this could actually be altered by the local markets, local exchanges, right?
Right. So there is a way to look at this and say that, all right, well, the AT&Ts and Verizons of the world, they think, listen, we built this big backbone infrastructure that connects, huge hundreds, thousands of miles across the United States, across oceans, around the world. So if these local carriers and local exchanges feel like they're being blocked out of certain markets where we've built infrastructure, they're more than welcome to build that last mile infrastructure and reach these underserved markets where there's less competition. I mean, I'm a little hard pressed, right? There's a little bit chicken and the egg scenario because it's this type of infrastructure. The big providers have had a huge head start in terms of having the carrier network built a long time ago in the days of telephones, and been able to build across and the original cable TV. They've had these existing infrastructures that they've been able to build on and reinvest in. And these local exchanges, are looking at net new infrastructure, huge investments, and so there's a bit of an inherited position by the larger providers that the smaller providers would really struggle to build net new infrastructure. So I'm trying to see once again both sides of the argument here. I think the game changer that Curtis alluded to is 5G technology, right? That's wireless technology with the latency of a landline, and if those types of technologies take off, then you might be able to really argue that the infrastructure costs are more minimal, and that the markets actually could have more competition without all the big investment to reach those underserved areas.